For those of you who I haven't met yet, I am Cheyenne Meadows, and I'm the High Ability Learning Specialist at the Nebraska Department of Education. And with me today, I have Jeremy Henniger, who is the statewide Director of Assessment. And when we have kind of started looking at NSCAS and how we're going to transition from using MAP scores for HAL identifications and services, and how does that work with the new NSCAS? So I've had a lot of questions and a lot of worries for what happens when MAP goes away, because as most of you know, your school districts will not be continuing MAP when the NSCAS through year comes out. So we're going to be looking at what is the new NSCAS, what does it measure, what data is it going to give you, and how can you use that to modify your identification systems or your services for high ability learners. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Cheyenne. Hopefully I can answer most of those questions, or start to answer most of those questions, because we're still building some of this out. But once again, hopefully we can answer some of those, or relieve some of at least the concerns about the transition around the 3 through 8 area. So what I thought, yeah, absolutely. So MAP growth will continue to be a district decision. It won't be outlawed or anything like that. That'll be a district decision. NDE will not continue to pay probably for 3 through 8 after that for ELA and for mathematics. So absolutely, it'll be a decision. So if a district isn't satisfied with NSCAS growth, hopefully they provide that information to us, and we can help fill in those areas and improve that as we go forward. But yeah, it's definitely a district choice after that. But what we'll do today is just kind of go over very briefly what NSCAS growth is, because there's lots of materials out there around that, and then get into some of the data that's going to be available and see if we can answer some of those questions around NSCAS growth and the data and how that is intersects with HAL and the programs there. So like I said, very briefly, so we announced, so what we're talking about for NSCAS growth is grades 3 through 8, mathematics and ELA specifically. We announced this back in fall of 2019 that we were moving to this adaptive through year model. It really is an evolution of NSCAS. It takes NSCAS summative and MAP growth and basically blends the two into a hybrid approach that we think is more aligned, more cohesive, and will better serve us as we move forward. So basically, just some things that I like to point out about it is it really does turn some of this on its head a little bit. Typically, summative assessments or assessments that are designed for summative purposes were all about policymakers, right? They were intended and created basically to serve that particular purpose around accountability and around policy making decisions. So we've really kind of taken this and said, who needs the information first? Educators and students. And so we're prioritizing their needs. We're still fulfilling the needs of the policymakers, because if we didn't, they would just change the law on us and make us do it anyway. But really, the last version of the federal laws basically allowed for this new approach to have interim testing serve some summative purposes. So some of the other things that it does is it also maximizes efficiency. The biggest one, I think, is in spring, right? Right now, districts test MAP growth in spring, and they test NSCAS summative in spring. We're going to only need to do one of those moving forward. So that will be one of the big things. The other thing is that the information that moves through the system is much better than either MAP growth or NSCAS summative. Basically, students' information where they performed previously in the test moves with them over time. So after this spring, so when a student tests in the spring, so say it's a 3rd grade student, they test an ELA in spring, their responses or how they did on the test in spring will move through and start to inform where they start in in the fall, and then fall to winter, winter to spring, and so on and so forth. So there's going to be a maximizing efficiency because we're always taking that information forward with us to inform where the student starts next. And therefore we'll be able to get better data as students go through different administrations of the assessments. Really, we're trying to maintain the actionable results that districts are used to with MAP growth and even improve upon them. We'll have enhanced information at grade level, which will really be beneficial, I think, not only to for all students, but in particular for HAL students as we move forward. And we'll get into that overall later on about that. And then the last thing there is that greater cohesion. We believe that when the system has a better cohesion in information, it will better inform where students are and how to move them forward, not only on grade level standards, but standards that stretch across the grade levels as well. This is just kind of a map of where we are and where we're going over the next 2 years. So this year is a partially operational year. This fall, or this, I'm sorry, this winter, we have a winter pilot coming up. All students are, we're asking all students to participate in that, either ELA or mathematics. And so the students will need to take at least one of those tests. Districts may choose to do both of those tests if they want to get that information for both of those tests for NSCAS growth. And then moving into spring, we'll have our first operational assessment. We'll be able to determine summative proficiency with that assessment and everything, like we would expect. And then next year will be fully operational. Students will be expected to use the system in fall and in spring. Winter will still be optional, but we think that most of you will want to use that because of the good information that it brings forward, and the opportunity for students another chance to show what they know and how they're growing throughout the year as we move forward. This is just we've produced a bunch of resources for districts' needs to try to. That is not working for some reason. I will try again in just a second. I was going to put the link there in the chat for you. There it is. This is the link to our NSCAS growth page. We produced a couple of introductory videos. One of them is for a more universal audience, so it might be for parents or for those outside the school system. The other one is for educators specifically, kind of talks about how educators have been involved in NSCAS all along and throughout this transition and during the development of NSCAS growth. Then we have a introductory video that I did during administrator days that really kind of gets in deeper than those introductory videos, but it's still a high level overview of NSCAS growth. And then we have 4 different vignettes that kind of break down even further and go a little bit deeper. Those have NWA employees that are working on the project with us, get into each one of those 4 areas that you see on your screen and dig a little deeper. That being said, all of this, there is still, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, we are still developing pieces of this. We're still doing that pilot in the winter and everything. So things are still being built out and added as we go. There's also a couple of documents there, NSCAS growth 1 sheet and frequently asked questions that are available, as well as a linking study, which I'm going to talk about next. So all those resources are available to you if you want to dig in deeper and find out more, if you haven't had a chance to do that already. So the linking study, so last spring in the phase 1 pilot that we did at the end of last spring, we conducted a common linking study between MAP growth and NSCAS. And what that really allows us to do is it generate a reliable RIT score from an NSCAS test, right? So if we give NSCAS, we can therefore predict or determine what that RIT score is likely to be based on how they perform on NSCAS. And so we use matching students, so students that took MAP growth and then students that took NSCAS, and then we were able to put that linking study together. One of the things that I'll mention is that for students that were at the extremes of the distribution, so students that really struggled or students that were very high, performed very high, there was some ceiling or floor effect that we saw. And I'm going to show you some data around that here really quick. What you should know about that is we anticipated that, and so we were correct in assuming that was going to be there. The biggest reason for that is because NSCAS, as it was back in the spring, only allowed students to go at grade level. So a fourth grade student taking mathematics was only shown fourth grade mathematics items. And so if they were struggling, they could only go down so far. And if they were excelling, they could only go up so far. So that created that ceiling or that floor effect, which we know we were pretty sure was going to happen. As we move forward, though, NSCAS growth will basically, because we're combining, right? We're combining MAP growth and NSCAS summative together, and those item banks together, students are going to be able to go off grade level starting in the winter pilot and beyond. And so we won't have those same limitations coming up as we go forward. We assume, right? We need to test that out and make sure and verify that as we get results coming up from this winter. I'll kind of show you this really quick. So there's a lot of information here. So I want to kind of focus on these two things. On the right-hand side is the linked RIT score. Sorry. It's the linked RIT score. The RIT score in the middle, on that middle column, is around what the students actually did. So if you look at those averages or the mean scores, they're not that different. From the two of them. What we know is there could be as much as a month between these two assessments, right? Students took one of them earlier, one of them later. There was instruction going on. Even if you give students the tests on the same day, there could even be some differences because of testing error and all of those types of things. So it's important to point out all of those things. So these numbers don't look too bad. They're only a couple points difference. But when we looked at the minimum and max, the minimum score and the max score for those two events, so we'll look at this 8th grade math here. It's a little bit different. So if you look for the students that took MAP growth in that middle column, once again, the lowest score, right, was a 136. The highest score was a 316. If you look at the linked version, right, the linked version only stayed at grade level. You'll see a big difference between the minimum score, 187, and then 310. So there's a difference there. So you see that floor effect, 187. So for the match students that took NSCAS, the lowest score they got was 187 on the RIT. And then 136 on MAP growth. So there's a difference there and a pretty big floor effect. The ceiling effect is not as great, which is encouraging in a number of different ways that I'll get into in the future. The reason why I bring this up is because this was what existed right now with what we know about the linking study. Once again, we think that this is going to kind of go away, maybe not entirely, but we believe it'll go away for the most part as we add those two item banks together and we allow students to go off grade if they're struggling or if they're excelling. So just kind of mention those going forward. And I'm going to come back to the higher end, that ceiling effect, the 316 and the 310 difference, a little bit about grade level and talk about that, because I think basically what it's able to show us is that we are able to dig in deeper at grade level and still almost produce the same RIT score even when we stick at grade level. And so in many ways we believe we're going deeper into the grade level content and are able to provide better information at grade level as opposed to having to move off grade level so quickly with some of our students that are excelling. And this is just that same slide again. I wanted to kind of come back to that information. That richer information at grade level is going to be a theme throughout the rest of the presentation, and we'll kind of come back to that over and over again. So just addressing some of the data that is available in the system. Each time a student takes NSCAS Growth, they are going to continue to get a RIT score, right? So it's based on that linking study, but we'll, moving forward, we'll continue to verify that. So if we need to adjust the scale score, the RIT scale score that's provided to students as we move forward, we'll definitely do that. And so it's really a pretty good approximation of what their RIT score would be had they taken NSCAS or had they taken MAP Growth. It's important to note for all the purposes that you'll continue to have access to national norms and national percentile information based on that score. So you'll still be able to still compare a student's performance from NSCAS Growth back to MAP Growth, and then look at a national comparison each time the students take the test. And I know that those scores are commonly used for a number of different purposes within districts. And so it was, we understood that it was important to be able to provide that RIT score going forward. We also understand that for historical purposes, having that RIT score be available to look at trend data over time, especially because NSCAS Growth or MAP Growth, MAP Growth has been such an integral part of the work that we have all been doing within Nebraska schools for a long time now. So we want to make sure that that is still available. In addition, each time a student takes the test, you're going to get grade level data back. Like I said, we think this is enhanced in a lot of ways because it really allows us to dig in pretty deep around grade level information, and those indicators are the same indicators that we use to determine summative proficiency. And so there's where some of our cohesion and alignment come in to play. Each time a student takes the test, you're going to get a current achievement level. Eventually, once we get enough data in the system, it will be a projected proficiency. So based on how the student is doing, we could project out how we think they're going to be, they're going to score in a summative way. And then at the end of the year, we'll also be able to provide that proficiency score that we need for accountability, for policy, and all of those types of things. And so we'll be able to do that one time a year, once again, based on the data that we have. It's probably important to mention not only the national percentiles, but we'll also have percentiles based on that proficiency as well. So yeah, so I'll come back to that question in a second. I do a bad job of paying attention to questions and then trying to answer them at the same time. So the Nebraska percentiles, right, based on proficiency, will provide another percentile look at students and where they're performing in comparison with other students in the state. And so there'll be two different percentiles that will be able to be provided there. Some design considerations, and I just thought I'd share this again. I pulled this from one of our other presentations. Really, NSCAS Growth starts out at prioritizing grade level information. We know how important it is for students to have access to grade level content and to be able to have an opportunity to learn that. So we want to be able to make sure we have the evidence that we need to do that summative score at the end of the year. As students perform at grade level, if they're struggling, it will allow them to go off grade level down, and it will allow them to go up as well, up grade levels. And so as the student moves off grade level, it prioritizes the next adjacent grade levels. So if we have a fourth grade student, it would after they do some fourth grade work, it would prioritize the fifth grade or the third grade content next. But then students could still move further off grade if their performance on items indicates that we need to dig in deeper at some other level, right? So it continues to do that, and that's a little bit different than what MAP Growth does currently. As far as grade level content, it really does do a better job of maintaining some boundaries, and then still being able to move up and down from there. So I moved a slide, Cheyenne, so we're coming up to that HAL stuff in just a second. So kind of get into a little bit more detail about some of the reporting here. So I've talked about enhanced information around grade level indicators. So every question that a student takes on these assessments, you're gonna get item level information about. So you'll get an indicator, whether that was on grade level most likely at the start of the test and maybe off grade level later on, but you'll get indicator information for each one of those items. You'll find out whether the student got it correct or not, whether it is easy, medium, or hard based on kind of the difficulty and parameters we've set there, and then item type information. So you'll know whether it's a multiple choice like most of the items in the bank, or whether those were other enhanced types of items going forward. So you'll get all of that information for each item a student takes every time they take the test. You'll also be able to roll that information up to classroom level, because that might be more useful to look at the class level or school or even district level than just at a student level, even though student level will give you really pretty good information as well. One of the things that I think is going to be very beneficial for the whole system as we move to NSCAS Growth is the integrated nature of the reporting. So we've worked really hard to make it so that that classroom level can be rolled up to school, can be rolled up to district, and then ESU, and then state level as well. And so we're able to look at that very easily at each of those levels in a way that we've never been able to do, or at least not easily done in the past. So it's already kind of built into the system, and I think that's very beneficial for us. So some considerations around HAL specifically, like I said, and I'll keep saying this, I guess, is that then enhanced information about grade level. So one of the things that I know, if you're working with students that have been identified as high ability learners, oftentimes as we think about what content those students should be exposed to, we start to go off grade level. One of the things that I think might be beneficial is that we can, around grade level information, we may be able to look at going deeper into some of that content at grade level, as opposed to going off grade level, which may help us as we move forward. And then I'm going to turn this over to Cheyenne in just one second. And I also think that there's the possibility moving forward of having some additional statistics that might help us diversify the identification as we move forward. So this new system will have additional statistics around growth and growth percentiles, and maybe that can help us think about identifying students in additional ways besides just a proficiency or a percentile at the end of the year. And so I think those are some things to consider. Cheyenne, do you want to comment on this a little bit?
Yeah, so I've sat down with Jeremy a couple times and we've talked about these implications because I know that a lot of people are going to be impacted by this. And so some of the different things we can think about with this new NSCAS growth, as Jeremy said, it's going to be pretty deep into grade level content as well as specific indicators. And so that's something that we can use in order to make things like compacting easier or acceleration. If we can look at, indicator specific things, and if they take the winter NSCAS and that you're going to be covering 6 of the indicators that were on the winter NSCAS in your next unit, and they've mastered 5 of those 6, you can see on their scores, then you can compact them out of that material and then bring them back in for that one indicator maybe they missed. Or since it prioritizes the next grade level, it makes for better acceleration decisions, because then you can see where they are performing, if they are performing on the next grade level in the fall. Are they already performing, if they're a 4th grade student, are they already performing high 5th grade level? Do we need to look at acceleration options? So a lot of that more in-depth data will allow us to make those decisions. Again, that also helps with placement or appropriate services, because we can dig into those in ELA and mathematics, and it will give us a lot more information. And then I get a lot of questions about the new NSCAS and identification. Because we use map growth to identify, or not map growth, sorry. A lot of you use map to identify students. And so if your district decides not to go with MAP anymore, what are the implications for this new NSCAS? And so, as Jeremy mentioned, NSCAS does give us kind of like proficiency data, achievement data, but it also gives us those growth and growth percentiles. When we think about identifying students using growth, this is a relatively new concept kind of coming to the field of high ability and as a whole. So when we think about using growth percentiles, that is something that I think is going to really open the door for more equitable identification, because students who maybe are from low SES or culturally linguistically diverse, maybe they don't quite have that proficiency level, but we see them making huge amounts of growth each year. And so that's something that we need to look at when we're thinking about looking at high ability learners. Additionally, it will give you that achievement score and projected achievement. So if at the beginning of the year you administer it in the fall and the student is already at advanced, we need to look at what can we do for that student in order to serve them for the rest of the year. And again, it gives us those local or national norms. So I know that MAP is nationally normed and a lot of people use national norms for high ability identification, but I really do encourage you to look at those state or local level norms in order to see who's performing high in your building, in your district, in your area.
Yeah, I'm really encouraged by the possibility of using those growth percentiles in a different way, especially for historically marginalized groups, and potentially identifying some of those students as high ability learners as we go forward with all of this. It's one of the things that we're going to be working on as part of a research piece around NSCAS growth, to see if we can better identify additional students moving forward. So stay tuned to that as we go. Just a couple other slides here, and then we'll answer some additional questions for you. Just to let you know, we have a full suite of trainings coming up around understanding NSCAS growth and using NSCAS growth, as well as our certified facilitator program, which will be adding to the list of professional learnings around understanding and using NSCAS growth as we move forward. We're going to still support MAP growth, because you might be choosing to use MAP growth in grades beyond 3 through 8, so K through 2 or 9 through 12, whatever the case may be. And there's still really good uses for that assessment moving forward. So we're going to have those continue to have those in place as we move forward. You can always contact us if something occurs to you later on that you want to ask a question about. You always have the ability to contact us later on and ask additional questions. So we had one question in the chat already that I haven't answered about Rule 10 and modified to allow for only one assessment. Yeah, so moving forward, NSCAS growth will count for your norm referenced and your criterion reference test. So you wouldn't necessarily have to give something else in addition to this test, right? So you wouldn't have to give MAP growth in the future or another norm reference test. NSCAS growth will suffice for both of those. I don't know if we need to change the Rule 10 to cover that or not, just to know that it does satisfy those requirements for both types of testing. So kind of like what we did with high school and ACT, it satisfied both. Of course, in that case, they actually changed the law around requiring both types of assessments. Yeah, so we also have a question here. Can you give a hypothetical example how we might use growth percentiles for ID, please? Yeah, absolutely. So if you have a student, so if you, instead of looking at proficiency, which that is a typical way to look at students that are proficient and where they score and percentiles, what you might do is, in addition, right? So we're not saying you wouldn't use that. This would be an additional method that you might look at to identify students. So you might look at students that have really high growth compared to students that are performing in similar to them. So if you look at a student So yeah, so say it is a English language learner, right? So they're already proficient in the language. They might be struggling with grade level content because they're learning in English and therefore they don't have all of the skills to grasp all of those things, but they are excelling at a very fast pace from where they were identified at the beginning of the year towards the end of the year. And so maybe those students with really high growth percentiles could be identified as students that would also be identified as high ability learners. And so basically it's really looking at different ways, or additional ways, I should say, additional ways of potentially identifying students for high ability learner status. And so once again, that's theoretical, I think, at this point. It's something that's potential, but always understanding and looking at different ways that we can identify students, especially in those historically marginalized groups, is always important, because sometimes it's just other factors that are coming into play other than students' straight ability, right? We try to get beyond that all of the time, but we know that all assessments have some of that going on within them. So that's just one thing that we've thought about so far. Other questions or comments, and anything else that we can help with at this point?
I know that Jeremy and the assessment team have been working tirelessly on this, and they're doing such a great job. And it has implications for everyone's work. And I just wanted to get ahead of it in the high ability space while we have time. If you guys have any questions in the future, you can contact the statewide assessment office, or if it's more HAL specific, you can contact me as well. I'm in touch with Jeremy pretty often. So if you have anything that pops up, just shoot us an email or give us a call, anything like that.
Cheyenne, I do have a question. We've talked in the past where MAPS and also NSCAS is an achievement test versus an ability test when it comes to identifying students. As you're revising Rule 3, are you going to look deeper into that? Because we've been discussing that as we've been revising ours. Do we need to include an ability test like LSAT or COGAT, or are we going to be able to just use NSCAS?
So it depends on your identification system. I always prefer that at least one grade, if not 2 grades, we do an ability test. Universal screening has been shown to find the most students in the largest candidate pool, and universal screening is about ability and not about achievement or like skill-based things. It's about all the subtests are some kind of spatial reasoning, verbal reasoning, nonverbal reasoning, and so those are truly ability measures. So I do encourage people to still use an ability test, but on a year you haven't given an ability test, like a lot of people give it in 3rd grade and 6th grade, feel free. I think this map or NSCAS Growth will give us a lot of really great new information on top of just pure achievement data.
Do you know roughly what % of schools use an ability test on top of MAP or NSCAS to help qualify our ID kids?
I don't have that data, but I know that a lot of schools use the COGAT. I know a couple of schools use the LSAT, some use the NView, and a lot more are continuing to get onto the COGAT. And so I don't know what percentage that is, but I do know that a fair amount of schools try to purchase those COGATs and give that ability test. Or some do the Naglieri nonverbal. But I would say far and away the best one to do is the COGAT.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Cheyenne, do you know if there's funding available for schools to help purchase something like those ability tests for smaller districts maybe that couldn't otherwise afford it? Not universal, like for all grades, but for, 3rd or 5th.
Yeah, so that's something definitely that if you receive HAL funds, your HAL funds can pay for those kinds of tests. I don't know at the state level. I've been doing some work with the title office to kind of understand how we can leverage title funds to help with high ability programs. I know that things like having the AP courses paid for or tests paid for and all those kinds of things used to happen at the state level, and they don't anymore. So I don't have a way to fund at the state level a COGAT or a universal screener, but HAL funds allotted to your district can be used that way.
Thank you.
Jeremy, we had another question. Are we concerned at all about the use of NSCAS growth alone, considering the smaller number of items and the higher error score?
Yeah, so I think one thing we should always be careful of is using a single assessment to do anything, right? So always we want to be thinking about different ways that we're confirming the information that we have. It is something that I would be taking a look at, right? So to make sure that you're comfortable with the decisions that you're making, and making sure that happens. I guess in some ways, right, and the nice thing about one test is it does provide two different scores in two different ways. I know that there are some limitations on that. I fully acknowledge that. But looking at that information with other information that you have from classrooms, from local assessments and all of those types of things, I think are important as well. And obviously with the error scores, those error scores are not, out of line or anything like that. And we'll see where the in numbers occur for us, because we are actually talking about how many items those are going to be as we move forward. So I think that those error bands are going to actually decrease moving forward. The other thing I'd say is that you're also using more data over time and better data to do those proficiencies. So there's some enhancements there as well. But always we want to be careful about making any decisions based on one set of numbers. Absolutely.
I encourage you all, as you take this information back to your districts, it is, like I said, if your district is not going to be purchasing MAP, you are going to have to kind of look at your identification plan and your identification system. And I encourage you to take this time when you're looking at incorporating the new NSCAS to look at your identification system as a whole. Speaking of danger of the single assessment, and make sure that you're not just relying on a single test score for HAL identification, and we are taking other data points into consideration. Any other questions?
Thanks everybody for your time.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you.